Before we break for lunch, it's a distinct pleasure to introduce Kathy Sandoval, our luncheon keynote speaker. Catherine, we are especially grateful for your participation today, as we know you will need to depart for additional obligations later this afternoon. A little bit about Kathy. She's from Campbell, was appointed to the California Public Utilities Commission by Governor Jerry Brown in 2011. She has worked as an associate professor at Santa Clara University School of Law since 2004. And she previously served as undersecretary and senior policy advisor for housing with the Business Transportation and Housing Agency from 2001 to 2004. She was vice president and general counsel with Z Spanish Media Corporation from 1999 to 2001, and was the director of Office of Communications Business Opportunities for the Federal Communications Commission from 1994 to 1999. Commissioner Sandoval earned her JD from Stanford Law School, a Master of Letters in Political Science from Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and a BA from Yale, a Yaley. All right. Please welcome Catherine.
Well, thank you. Good to see you again after the break. So I really appreciate the invitation from the Essential Elements organizers to be here with you and to share a few more minutes of just thoughts and questions during this time right before we go to the lunch break. So first, I'd like to apologize that I can't stay with you this afternoon. After this, my advisor, Jamie, and I are going to a water conference. So, because Jamie is my legal renewable energy and water advisor. So the California Public Utilities Commission, as you may know, regulates investor-owned electricity, natural gas, water, telecommunications. We also regulate rail safety, rail crossings. We're also the first public utilities commission in the nation to really create the category of transportation network carriers. So we were the ones who legalized Uber and Lyft, really took them out from being illegal gypsy cabs and gave them a legal regulatory home. So there's been a lot of discussion here about the role of regulation, but I would submit to you that that companies like Uber would not have the insurance that they have, would not be accountable in the way that they are now if it were not for regulation. So regulation indeed can play an important role in innovation. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about thinking about as we're looking forward for the essential elements of growth, not just in the Central Valley, but in California. What are some of the key elements? And so as I think about this, I think again about infrastructure, as well as education and imagination. So if I can just take a few minutes to share with you some thoughts about those different issues. On infrastructure, as you know, and as you hear from my bio, I have done a lot of work throughout my career on communications issues. I am a tenured professor at Santa Clara University School of Law, where I normally teach communications law as well as antitrust law and contracts. Since I am serving as a commissioner on the PUC, I'm only teaching contracts right now, so I'm teaching a first-year contracts class. But I also worked at the FCC and have very extensive background both in the policy and technology of communications. So in looking at communications issues, as we mentioned earlier, communications is becoming increasingly foundational to everything that we want to do. Everything that we want to do with education, everything you want to do with workforce development, the visions that we've had about energy, indeed net energy metering would not function as it does now and as it can in the future without robust communications. So in thinking about communications and just having the opportunity to be here at this lovely place at Harris Ranch, it reminded me of a story that I heard from TURN, the Utility Reform Network. So as you may know, TURN is a consumer organization that helps consumers that have questions about their regulated utility service, including bills and service quality problems. And their slogan is lower bills, livable planet. So Turn often hears from a variety of customers. Many of them are low-income customers. Some of them are rural customers in different parts of the state. And one day they got a call from Harris Ranch. Well, it was a scratchy call, actually. And somebody from Harris Ranch from the office said that they were having terrible problems with their phone service. And their phone service was going down often, and the quality was terrible. And they were very concerned because this was right before Thanksgiving. Now, if you've ever had the opportunity to come here on the weekend of Thanksgiving or right around Christmas, this place is hopping. All right. I tell people they have the best bathrooms on the 5, right? So, I'm from LA because I call it the 5. But, the best bathrooms on the 5 are here at Harris Ranch. Plus, this is our favorite place to stop for a nice steak lunch. So Thanksgiving is just a huge weekend. In addition, this place really is an oasis. My husband and I have stayed here several times at the lovely hotel. My sister has driven up from LA to join us here so we can all hang out and have a nice steak dinner. In the summer, you go to the pool. You deal with also the lovely smell of the cows, which is always an interesting trek from the parking lot. And it truly is an oasis because not only do you see the birds, the starlings, which nest in the trees, and it really is amazing in terms of, I describe it as the Harris Ranch Empire with the gas station, the conference center, the hotel, and all of that. But also when you think about the communications infrastructure that is here, and I mean right here, right? This infrastructure isn't across the street, right? This infrastructure isn't down the street, right? What you can do here, you can't do just on the other side. If when you're staying at the hotel, or just go out in the parking lot, you can see the fields, right? So making sure that that infrastructure works, that the communications works, absolutely critical, right? And for travelers who are coming down from San Francisco, coming up from LA, they have certain expectations. And increasingly, we are hearing that as we travel throughout the state, that this is one of the things that really bugs travelers the most, right? Why doesn't my cell phone work, in your room, in your parking lot, even though the hotel has nothing to do with the cell phone? Well, Harris Ranch had called because, in fact, the issue wasn't just cell service, but their landline service wasn't working, and so they were missing bookings as well. And so the Utility Reform Network worked together with Harris Ranch and their service provider, AT&T, to improve service to this area and to make sure that they would have reliable service. And indeed, this is also one of the fundamental missions of the PUC and a fundamental requisite of California law. Under California Public Utilities Code, Section 451, utilities have a duty to provide safe, reliable service at just and reasonable rates. And our duty as regulators is to ensure that the utilities under our jurisdiction comply with their duties, right, with regard to both that duty as well as a number of other duties. And that particular duty is an example of what we like to call in the law the debate between standards versus rules, right? So it doesn't say provide safe service in exactly this way, right? Provide reliable service in exactly this way. It creates a standard that they're supposed to meet, safe, reliable service. And for our rate-regulated utilities, we do general rate cases to determine what are just and reasonable rates. So we have a number of companies like AT&T and now Frontier that are no longer rate regulated, but they are still subject to these legal standards. So as we look again at the idea of how do we get to the essential elements of a prosperous California, that includes, I believe, absolutely must include a prosperous Central Valley, really developing that infrastructure so that we describe Harris Ranch not just as an oasis, of a great place to visit with wonderful bathrooms and great steaks and a very nice hotel and very nice staff, and an oasis of communications, right, that you don't find across the street, but really as a model that other places in the valley are able to replicate, an infrastructure that you are able to access. This is really going to be critical. Because as we look at issues, you only have to go out in the hallway to see the Harris family, and John Harris, as you know, has long been very active in the water issues here in California. And he has these educational poster boards out there talking about water and water use and how water is used in California. So agriculture, as you likely heard from Secretary Ross, is the largest user of water in the state of California. And residential users are also large users, but agriculture is by far the largest user. So when I've gone to Apps for Water hackathons, one of the first questions I'm often asked by either coders or investors is, who are the biggest users, and in water, where's the biggest target? If you wanted to target something for saving water, what would you target? And the answer is, without a doubt, ag. All right? So the question is, how do we get there? So we've seen a lot of innovation here in terms of agriculture and water, wise water use. And indeed, again, this area has been a leader. I've had the opportunity to visit at the Fresno WET Center, the Water Energy Technology Center. Bakersfield is also developing a Water Energy Technology Center. There's a lot of innovation that is going on in this valley around those issues. And as I've met with farmers like Joe Del Bosque and gone to farms, you all know, anybody who's worked with farmers, that they are very, very conscious of the costs that are going into the input of their crop. It was really impressive with Joe how he could really calculate the cost to the almond of all the different inputs that go into that. And so farmers really have absolutely no incentive to waste water. But one of the things that we heard at the Apps for Ag hackathon at West Hills College that we had a couple of years ago, and I got a lovely cowboy belt as a belt buckle for being a judge there. But one of the things that we heard about water is that there is still a bit of both a generational divide and an information divide in thinking about how do you use water differently. Because on the one hand, any farmer is extremely conscious of cost. On the other hand, farmers, like the rest of us, are often reluctant to change what seems to be working. One of our great assets here in California is that California long ago also founded UC Davis as an agricultural college. So the Aggies have really become world leaders in agricultural research and really scientific research. And having had the opportunity to speak at some conferences at UC Davis, their strong foundation in agricultural research, I think, has also helped them to become leaders in water and energy, and increasingly also technology and communications. So as you know, UC Davis puts out a number of standards, and they do tremendous research to help determine, how do you optimally grow a plant, right? What's the best mix of water, if you're going to use extra nutrients, if you're going to use pesticides, sun, whatever, what's the best mix and what is really optimal? And the trend really is looking at not, flooding a field, and of course we don't have the water to do that very much anymore, but really giving each plant what it needs. But in order to give each plant what it needs, you need to know what the plant needs. So in the past, we've done that by looking at the plant, right? And trained people can look at a plant and understand what it needs. I remember when I was in college at Yale, I once had a plant that I noticed my fern was getting kind of brown, and I kept watering it, and I'm like, why is my fern getting brown? And I kept watering it, and then one day I stood back and I really looked at the fern, and I realized all the brown parts were on the radiator. Okay, so I was missing the big picture. But now there are opportunities with sensors where you can put a sensor in the ground to see what the soil needs, but increasingly they're looking at sensors on the plants to better see what the plant needs, right? Either the plant at the root or other parts of the plant. And so I found that one of the things that some of the participants said at West Hills at the Apps for Ag hackathon, where they were second or third generation farmers, is that they had to talk, I was often their dad, into using new techniques that were recommended by UC Davis and into investing in this technology to really better understand how much water they needed. And so one of the young farmers said, he really had to walk his dad through why spending money in the end was going to be a good investment, because this was something his dad hated to do. But in the end, he came around to it, and also saw the proof was in the pudding, which was not only in a good investment, but in bigger yields. So there really are tremendous opportunities, and I think this is also part of the opportunity that we need to grasp, and that places like West Hills are really at the forefront to be able to grasp, is that you have students there who really are able to be there at this intersection of ag tech, right? And to also be the translators to their parents, right? How do you move from the way that it's always been done, right, into a new way? And this is certainly something that I've seen all over California. If you've seen a lot of farms that grow alfalfa, often they still irrigate using the wagon wheel. And I've met people who said, when they were little kids, they got a summer job literally pushing the wagon wheel. And, through the wheel, you can irrigate and you can use human energy. And I met somebody who indeed was using the same wagon wheel that their grandpappy was using. Well, while you can do that, the question ultimately is that the most efficient way to continue to water and to nourish the plants? And really, are we creating the incentives to be efficient? Because as we look at also water resources, we know California has been through a tremendous drought over the last several years, and this drought is having huge impacts on our state. We have all seen it and felt it through the terrible wildfires, and I have had the opportunity to visit with communities who have been devastated by wildfires. Earlier this year in September, Jamie and I and my team had the opportunity to visit Middletown in Lake County and hold a very instructive set of public participation hearings and a workshop there, both in our call completion proceeding about whether or not calls were being completed or being dropped, and also in our water energy nexus proceeding. Both on the way there and right before the hearing, we toured the area, including the areas of Middletown that had been devastated by the very recent Clayton fire. It was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, to see all of the homes that had been burned and destroyed, and in that case by an arsonist, and to see the destruction there that had occurred. And driving up to Middletown from Sacramento, where we had in fact been at another meeting on water issues, I drove through just hundreds and hundreds of acres that had been devastated by the Valley Fire. And the Valley Fire was one of the largest fires in California. Well, when we look at these fires, one of the things that Jamie and I have been looking at through the Water Energy Nexus proceeding is the impact of these fires on communities, on public safety, on utilities, and on utility infrastructure. So years ago, the PUC created an opportunity for utilities to basically recover the cost when infrastructure gets burned in a fire. They have to both clean up. This is a requirement of state law, because when you have big fires, especially buildings, homes, and also poles, there's lots of toxins. And so the state has a program and indeed a mandate to clean up through the EPA and through the toxics program. But also, neighborhoods can't be reoccupied until there's power again. So our electric utilities are often right there with the firefighters on big-scale incidents. They're right there at incident command, coordinating with them in some cases to turn off power lines to make sure that the impact isn't worse, and to rebuild power lines quickly. But the cost of these is staggering. Where some of the fires, like the Butte fire in Calaveras County, the cost of infrastructure was in the hundreds of millions of dollars from one fire, right? So other fires, it might cost $28 million. Other fires, it might cost $3 million. But there are several fires in California that have led to costs of $100 million or more in burned infrastructure. So looking at what we can do to reduce wildfire risk is going to be critical not only to you as ratepayers, but to all of us as consumers of water. Because indeed, as we start thinking beyond the silos, this is one of the things that we talked about, right? We often think about I'm in charge of a water agency, or I'm a water consumer, or I regulate investor-owned utilities. But the question is, how do we really think in partnerships, right? System partnerships that look not just at the water here, but where our water comes from and how we can nurture the health of our watershed and the communities served by our watershed so that we have healthier watersheds and we avoid devastating wildfires. So I'd submit to you that there are opportunities that we all should be looking at for new partnerships to really look at your watershed. What are the watersheds for the Central Valley? And what are you doing to really partner with the watersheds, right? And whether it is the watersheds here in the Sierra or the watersheds to the north. In Calaveras County and in counties much farther to the north. Calaveras County, in fact, provides most of the water for the East Bay, and we had another terrific workshop at the PUC on September 20th in the Water Energy Communications Nexus proceeding, where we had a really terrific speaker from the San Francisco PUC, talking about how during the Rim Fire of 2013, it put the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir in tremendous danger. And Hetch Hetchy, as you may know, provides water for the city of San Francisco. So here was a fire way up in the Sierra that potentially endangered the watershed and the water source for the city of San Francisco. Now, of course, it's a crazy story how the city of San Francisco came to own this. Back in the day, you could do things like the mayor of San Francisco did, who literally climbed a tree and put up a sign saying, "This water belongs to the people of the city of San Francisco." And that was how you claimed water back then. Well, those days are long gone, but the duty for all of us to protect our watershed is so important. So what they found is that during that fire, one of their biggest challenges, once again, was communications. They had tenuous communications to begin with. They had some satellite, which became quickly obscured by all the smoke. On a good day, they had some cell, which also quickly became inoperative. And it turned out, in fact, that their lifeblood, what kept them able to communicate, was one lonely payphone in Moccasin, California, that was near Hetch Hetchy. And this payphone was such an important source of communications that they had, the SFPUC had people going to banks in San Francisco and driving up there to make quarter runs so that people would be able to make calls from this payphone. I submit to you that here in California we can do better. And it is important to look at those hard lines, right, and how we can harden our lines, but to also look at new technologies. At the same meeting, we also heard from an innovator in the Silicon Valley whose office is actually right next to Santa Clara University about the opportunity to deploy mesh networks, which is also something that I have heard from a number of people could be deployed in fields. And when you look at mesh networks that have been deployed for a while and are currently being deployed, not only for the military, but also for mining and other industries, there is a real opportunity to build basically pop-up networks that could be moved and with relatively little connective infrastructure, you can develop really agile communications. Because just like the farmer who's a little bit reluctant to change from how they've always used water, we find this as well with firefighting. I had the opportunity to meet with some firefighters and talk about the issue of how communications or the lack thereof was hampering their firefighting. Because today, this is one of your most critical firefighting tools. With a live connection, you can download maps that give you information about hot spots so you can keep your firefighters safe. It can tell you where the fire is going, especially if you can get full motion video. It can help you make decisions about coordination. Without a connection, then what you're doing is you're meeting at the fire camp in the morning, you're getting data that somebody had to drive out of the fire zone, go back to a place where there was communication, which is often an hour or more away, do some downloads and uploads, and then drive back in the next morning. So you're getting information that is 8 hours old, right? That is a really long time in a fast-moving wildfire. So when I was talking to one fire chief about, how we could make things better, the fire chief at one point said to me, we're woodland firefighters. We shouldn't need a cell phone to fight a fire. And I said, yes, this is true, but you should not have to fight fires like it's 1950, let alone 1850. Again, I submit that here in California we can do better. So to bring this back to essential elements in education, addressing our fundamental infrastructure is also going to be critical to addressing education and creating new opportunities. One of the things that I often think about as a professor is also how do the communications capabilities that the students have at their home affect my ability to assign homework to them if I expect them to do their homework at home and not at the university. So Santa Clara University is blessed to now have gigabit internet through the hard work of the university and the fathers and the cooperation and the availability of some tariffs through Scenic. But I cannot assume that even in the Silicon Valley that the students have gigabit connections at home. Indeed, most people in the Silicon Valley can't buy gigabit internet today at their residence. And indeed, I have some students who live in Palo Alto, but I have one student who her job is she works at a horse stable as a horse trainer assistant, and she lives there near the stable. And so she has very poor, very, very poor internet, so she has to do most of her homework when she comes to Santa Clara. Now, I am sure at West Hills you have many students who are in that situation. And traditionally what we have done when we talk about silos is as we have funded infrastructure, we have tended to fund the building, right? Concentrate infrastructure in the building or in the program, prohibit the use of that infrastructure outside of the building. But when you think about homework needs to flow like water, right? It doesn't just stay in one place. You don't expect the student to do all of your work right there. You expect them to go home and do some of it on time outside the classroom time. And so for me, this has always created barriers to the thought of the flipped classroom. And it's something that I've been thinking about increasingly as I am finding that my students are really enjoying the times when we are able to really do exercises in class where we really put their learning to work, don't spend as much time really focusing on here's the cases and not just the summary but the analysis of the cases, but put the cases in action through testing and hypos that we do in class through collaboration. They really enjoy that, but I do fear that they're getting a bit of a short shrift in terms of the hypos and in terms of the cases and the case analysis. So to make up for that, I have PowerPoints that I post. They're reading the cases. I can tell that they're doing the reading. But some of my colleagues have gone to videotaping lectures that then students can watch at home. But once again, if you don't have the communications infrastructure that you think that the students will be able to access at home, they're not going to be able to do that homework, let alone actually having an interactive class, right? So you have to have awesome communications to be able to have an interactive class that you're doing via video and communications. And I also feel like in class, one of the things that I do the most is also really, I spend time looking at their faces to help figure out what they're understanding, right? And I know like if the students ever go like this, okay, like you probably saw that from some of the fans of the losing baseball team last night. They were probably going like this, which seems to be like a universal "oh my God" sign. So I'm always looking for my students making the "oh my God" sign, and then I know that I'm not reaching them. So the last thing I'd like to talk about as we close is to think about, we've talked about infrastructure and how that is critical to our economy and to education. And also to think about, to leave us with a thought about imagination. You know, as I was listening to the previous discussions, you know, it reminded me also that often we get constrained by the cookie cutter. Often we get constrained by what is. And that one of our greatest tools is imagination. And indeed, one of the things that I tell my students is that some of the brain research has showed that we literally use different neurons, different pathways in our brain for imagination than for memorization. Yet for so long, so much of our educational system has been based on memorization, right? And this is why when you have workers who are like, I've never encountered anything exactly like this before, I don't know what to do. I was taught how to do X. This is why. I don't know what to do, right? The point is we're trying to train people to be little MacGyvers, right? So MacGyver's back on, so now people who are millennials are starting to get the reference again. I grew up as a MacGyver fan. So one of my roommates, I thought, once gave me a tremendous compliment when she said I had MacGyver-esque talents. So I really appreciate that, because what we need to do is foster that imagination, foster the boundaries so that we can go beyond the silos, identify nexus thinking. So I have been a leader along with Jamie in promoting the water energy communications nexus, because it is going to be communications that will really help us to get to the next step, not only of measuring and monitoring, but really using wisely and really changing how we use our resources in California. And last, I'd like to close with something that Governor Brown told me when we met, and I had the tremendous honor of his appointment to the California Public Utilities Commission. We had several very interesting conversations, and one of the things that Governor Brown said to me is, he said, as a professor, I think one of the things that will make you well suited to being a commissioner is that you are trained to listen and ask good questions. And I was so impressed that he put the listening first. As often as professors, we think about the lecture, although the law school format is really much less about the lecture than it is about listening. Now, the traditional Socratic method of law school is asking students questions, trying to pin them to the wall, which is something that I have never been comfortable with. But I do try to ask them questions. And often I get from my students uncomfortableness because they say, "You're the only law professor who asks us what we think." And even when I taught at UC Berkeley School of Law, the students at Bolt Hall said the same thing. They were really uncomfortable that I kept asking them, what did they think, right? What do you think about this trend in the law, right? How would you use these facts, right? Okay, the case says fact X, and then therefore the court came to this conclusion. I found that my Berkeley students were really great at repeating a case, right? But the question is, all right, if you change the facts, right? If it were something different, then what happened, and how would you use these facts? It was fascinating that actually I found my Santa Clara students to be better at being able to use a changed set of facts, in part, I think, because they have more life experience than some of the Berkeley students, but the Berkeley students will catch up. So in closing, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate this convening. Would like to thank so much Professor Van Horn and everybody who's been involved with this convening, to thank the Chancellor, and to thank all the participants, and to thank you once again for welcoming me and Jamie to the Central Valley to be here as your partners. And we look forward to listening to you and working with you to come to creative MacGyver-esque solutions. Thank you.